Welcome to IDG. I am Sonu Bhasin, and IDG is the Informal Discussion Group, a carry forward from our days in college, which is St. Stephen's. Our guest today comes from a family of Stephanians. Sameer Seth joined college in BSc Honours Chemistry because he says he did not get enough marks to do Eco Honours. And here I've spent all my life thinking that the science types required more marks than the art types. Anyway, we live and learn. But when he was in college studying chemistry, I wonder if Sameer thought that he would put his learnings to good use later in life, in food. So yeah, apparently there is a huge connection between food and chemistry. And to tell us this and more, I am delighted to welcome Sameer Seth of Bombay Canteen to today's IDG. Welcome, Sameer.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much.
Lovely. So we've all been wanting to speak to you. Before you joined, we were talking about your food, and I'm sure that we'll talk more about it. But since this is the IDG, tell us about your days in college. Besides doing chemistry practicals in the science lab, what else did you manage to do?
Honestly, I think I spent very little time in chemistry, and I think when you and I were chatting earlier in the week, I was telling you, I wish there was someone who drew the line between food and chemistry a lot sooner for me, and I think I would have paid a lot more attention in class. That being said, spent a lot of time, I think the first year I was volunteering to sort of organize Harmony, and I think that got me hooked, and that led me down this path where it eventually was part of the Students' Union Society and raising money for Harmony, organizing it all 3 years, getting involved in a whole bunch of things in college to just do anything to get away from studying. I think that's the way I sort of live life, and I've sort of made lifelong friends over there, which is the most sort of cherishable sort of outcome of college.
Yeah.
And I think it continues to be so. Like, I think some of my closest friends to date are from that period in my life. And I think that's what one takes away. Obviously, now I'm sort of remembering certain parts of chemistry that happen. And I think we had, obviously with food, etc., like it keeps coming back. But I think it's funny you mentioned practicals, because I think the only reason I got through the practicals because I had this side deal with another classmate of mine. She would be my lab partner and do all the hard work, and I would be running around and trying to get away from chemistry at that point.
Yeah. So, chemistry is not as versatile a subject like, say, mathematics, which is what I did, and like, say, eco. So when you were in college, 3 years, what did you think you would do later in life with a degree in chem?
Honestly, I come from a family which has always been part of, like, both sets of grandfathers were part of the government. My generation, with my father and his siblings, etc., everyone got into the corporate world. So that is sort of the life trajectory one had seen, right? Like, and I think it was one of those things where you were told that, no, you should do an MBA after this. And both my dad and my chacha went to IMCAL. And so that became sort of a little bit of a North Star in my life. So the logical step was taking that step to doing an MBA, not knowing as a 20-year-old that there were other options available. I think food had always sparked my interest, but I think what ended up happening was everyone around me would always tell me, no, that can wait. First do something that will be more sort of, I guess, foundational.
Job worthy.
I still remember this after the first year at college. My dad was like, you must get an internship in the summer. You can't just be hanging around. Me to meet one of his friends, I remember, at TCS, and who was very senior at TCS at that point, who actually, if I remember correctly, might have been from college, but I could be wrong. And I think the conversation was such that he asked me a very simple question. He asked me a question that, what do you want to do? And I had just organized Harmony for the first time gotten into that. And I was super excited. Like, it was just such an amazing experience doing that. And I was like, I love events. And I could see my father's face like go down. It's like, what sort of answer is this? Like you're sitting in front of someone very senior in the corporate world and you're saying you love to manage events. And I was like, there's truly sort of like, it came from the heart at that point. But I guess as a 18, 19-year-old, you just took away that was probably the wrong answer. And then you sort of followed the sort of the trodden path, so to speak. And I don't think I regret any of that. Like, I think right after college, I went to IIM Kozhikode, eventually joined Citibank in Bombay. And that
your dad's, your dad's a senior corporate professional. So his heart must have swelled with pride when you joined Citibank, right?
completely. And like part of the, like back in the early 2000s, the MA program, as it was called, the Management Associate program, was like a big deal. So, and honestly, it was a great training ground as a 22-year-old, right? I think the one thing that sort of I realized many years later was that jumping into an MBA straight after college was probably not the right route to go, because I had no idea what was being spoken about. I mean, you can sit in organizational behavior classes and like speak about culture and all these sort of other sort of jargony words, and you have no idea what it means.
Yeah.
So, but I think City turned into sort of a amazing sort of continuation of that learning journey. I worked on the real estate side and the mortgage division on the consumer side. And honestly, like, who knew, right? Like, my life still revolves around that. Like,
real estate.
understanding real estate very carefully. As a 22-year-old, I was taught how to read legal documents, which still holds me in good stead. So I guess it worked out. There was no clarity at that point, but it sort of led down that trajectory of eventually giving into that passion around food and knowing that I wanted to do something around food.
So, actually, I'm quite surprised. The more I speak with people, the more I realize that when things are happening at a particular time, we really don't know why they are happening in our life. It's only later that we say, oh, thank God that happened. If that hadn't happened, I wouldn't be able to do this. So I've learned to just, even when things are not going well, to keep reminding myself that there must be a reason. And that's how I've passed time during pandemic. Ki kuch to achai hogi later in life, pata chalega. Acha, but then Citibank, you just gave up cold turkey one day. So did you talk to your dad before doing that? What made you do that? And then you got into your passion, which is food.
Yeah, and I don't think I realized at that time, like, I loved working, basically worked across Delhi and Bombay. I loved my stint in Bombay and equally hated my stint in Delhi. And I think didn't have the language to recognize that what was happening around there was like really bad culture, right? Like, it just felt like, it was just terrible. There's no other way to describe it. But at that point, like, I knew that I wanted to do something in food and spoke to my family about it. My grandmother had the very typical grandmotherly response, bank chhod ke parathe bechne ja rahe ho. And I think my dad was like, I hope you're recognizing that you will be working when everyone else is off. Like, it still rings true every December in my years when we are like busy as can be and running around every December. But I think I was lucky enough to find someone who was running a restaurant and willing to take a chance on me. And it was equal. Like, I was taking a chance, they were taking a chance. And what ended up happening, it's a story I told my parents much later. I met one of the partners of this restaurant group in Delhi called, they ran this brand called Shalom, and they had about 12 other restaurants at that point. And he on a whim basically told me, come join. He used to handle finance and the other aspects of the business. And I'd known him through some people over the years. And he said, come join. And so based on that one conversation in my sort of naive little state, I went and quit Citibank and like gave my notice, all of those things. And a week before I was supposed to join this place, I went and met the main operating partner. And he was like, oh yeah, you're joining. I heard about that. I don't know what you're going to do here. So I don't think we can pay you right now. But come join and then we'll figure it out. And obviously I didn't have the sort of face to go back to my parents as a 25-year-old, 26-year-old and say like, by the way, I'm doing this and I'm not going to get paid. So I joined as a quote unquote intern. But within a month, like they were in the midst of opening a new restaurant at that point. And I think I deep dove into it. And in the first 6 months, I think I opened 3 restaurants with them. And obviously they very quickly saw that I had a lot of value to add.
So the real value was really understanding real estate, location, and reading the
yeah,
local maps.
just roll up your sleeves and get into it, right? Like I think at the end of the day, the restaurant business is not rocket science. I think it requires you to just be sort of see what's happening and absorb a lot about. And that was truly sort of like being thrown into the deep end. With this company, I opened 3 restaurants, and in the course of the next 2 years, shut 7 restaurants with them, and learned a lot what to do and what not to do.
Yeah.
These guys are still friends, and I think they just had a very different mindset. And honestly, like I went through that period just absorbing a lot. And at that point where they were on a downturn, where clearly it was not working, I joined them at their peak, and unfortunately, they had a series of events happen which led to them not being able to manage what they had. I realized that I wanted to do something on my own, but didn't have a team, didn't have a thought, didn't have anything. So luckily I had a little bit of foresight at that point to have done a GMAT while I was still at Citibank, that if this doesn't work out, I can still hopefully do something. And Cornell's hotel school has always been on my mind as a sort of looking at being trained further in this field. And ended up applying to Cornell, and with the intent that maybe it's time to go experience other things, travel, and got through. And that really sort of was sort of an inflection point for me in 2010.
Yeah. So then you ended up in Cornell, and this was a 1-year course.
This was a 1-year program.
And like you said that it's better to do an MBA after having a little bit of work ex. So Cornell must have, it would have helped that you had worked with Shalom and had learned what to do, what not to do. So what is something that you learned more at Cornell? How did it shape you as a restaurateur later?
So I think in 2 ways. And I think, I'll get a little into it. I think Cornell was the first time, and I'll honest about it, was the first time I was in an academic environment which was actually really stimulating. And that's sort of unfortunately the aspect of having only studied in India till then, that you're just basically taught through rote learning at the end of the day. You're supposed to sort of prepare for an exam in some way, shape, or form, and that's about it. Suddenly I was given a free hand, and I was like focusing on F&B and entrepreneurship. Like it was, you could choose your own track in this program, and you could, based on your experiences, there were professors all around who would like this. There was a 3-month course on just restaurant design, and each basically while you were going through the course, I still remember you had to basically design and conceptualize your own restaurant. And the eventual final exam was a fair where you had to raise money for your concept, and like you basically got your grade based on the amount of money you raised. So like just sort of the real world application and the thought process of how you design a course and a pedagogy which actually makes people think in the way potentially with the real world would do. And it was actually the same professor who not forced me, but like triggered the thought that, oh, you've gone through this really interesting set of experiences back in India. Why don't you take 6 months and do an independent study? I'll guide you through it and understand like what went wrong there and what goes right in restaurants that are able to scale. And literally she opened up like her network to me to speak to sort of the best restaurateurs in the US, to sort of understand how they manage their businesses, what they did. And it gave me a really interesting sort of reflective 6 months in terms of what I had gone through and what probably shouldn't have happened. Eventually that networking really helped for me to get a job with one of them. And as part of this, I ended up meeting Chef Floyd Cardoz at that point. He sort of, I guess, left me with a question after our first meeting. I met him as a student, asking him questions about how they manage restaurants, what his philosophy is. Like, he's like, why aren't you going back to India and like doing something there? Why do you want to be here? I was like, I want to be here because I think, and this was the other part that Cornell did. There was another professor who was like, you need to treat the next 2 years of your life as a continuation of what you're seeing here, because you can't just be like, now I'm ready. You need to go into the trenches and really sort of, because till that point, I'd never done restaurant operations. I'd always worked in sort of the finance, the marketing, sort of the other aspects of firefighting in any organization. And he was like, you have to get into the operating of it and just go work with and luckily I was able to find, like, through this project, I got both the offers I got at that point. One was with Chef Floyd, and one was with another group that I eventually joined initially because Chef Floyd's project got delayed at that point. But as part of that earlier meeting, which I was mentioning with Floyd, which left me with this one thought. He's like, if you ever decide to go back, tell me, I'll do this restaurant with you. He probably was just joking around. Like,
wow.
And then he probably does hundreds of these meetings with want-to-be restaurateurs, etc. And he just left me with that thought. And I guess that sparked something in me that I wanted to. And he was working with a restaurant group at that point, which runs Shake Shack, Gramercy Tavern, Union Square. These are all institutions in New York, which still exist. They're some of the best brands in the US. And the guy who started them was a gentleman called Danny Meyer, who's considered to be sort of one of the pioneers in the business. And I was convinced that I wanted to work with them. And eventually, even though like I couldn't work with them immediately, I had a brief stint with a French restaurant on the Upper West Side in New York, and again saw firsthand what terrible culture does to a restaurant, an organization. And I think that I've always carried with me, and was eventually able to join Floyd and Danny. And that was a complete game changer for me in my outlook towards how do you set up something which is high quality, which takes into account behavior around you, which takes into account like how do you create an organization that's built to last versus it just being like Union Square Hospitality Group, as it's called, is completing its 40th year. Like its first restaurant is still around in New York City. Like that takes a very different mentality from versus opening and just running. And I think there were many things that happened during these 3-4 years in the US, which really changed my outlook towards what.
Yeah, but to continue with your, 2 years after Cornell, you said you really had to roll up your sleeves and, spend time in the trenches. What does that really mean? I mean, we've all been guests at restaurants and in hotels, so we really don't know what the trenches are. And so what did you end up doing for 2 years?
The trenches literally are, you need to go through and understand every aspect of the restaurant. Like I remember this example given to me like by someone I was chatting with in the US. He's like, you will suddenly like be like in a situation where you're losing all your cutlery, for example. Like suddenly you're buying a lot of cutlery.
Rise and sleep in silence.
You're buying a lot of cutlery all of a sudden and you have no idea where the cutlery is going. It could be like you, and if you really know, what happens is like your servers are getting lazy and they're just basically, if you look at the back of the house, when your plates go back, it needs to be organized in the way it goes back. And if it's not organized, it'll get your cutlery will literally go into the trash. And if you don't, like, you can be sitting here and sitting in an office and wondering why you're getting these bills, and you'll have no idea why you're getting these bills. Like, so my training literally started as a busboy in New York City, moved up to a server over a couple of months. And like, as you're bussing, as you're serving, you recognize that when you're in those shoes, it's a very different experience. You think the way any restaurant is organized is actually basically organized like the army, by the way. It is, if you think of how a kitchen is organized, the kitchen has a head chef. Under the chef, there are sous chefs. Under the sous chefs, there are called chef de parties. They're all French. It's basically the French way of organizing a kitchen. Started about 150 years ago by this chef called Escoffier. And it still goes on till date because it works, because it's basically you basically drill it down to battalions. And each battalion has a little project every day and they have to prep for that project, and it sort of works in order and it moves up to this thing. And only when you've sort of gone through that process will you understand how you can sort of run a very smooth operation. Similarly, kitchen is known as back of the house. Front of the house is similarly organized, where you'll have a restaurant manager, you'll have servers, you'll have busboys, you'll have stations. So if you were to come into one of our restaurants, like the way we would refer internally to ops is every table has a number. Ideally in a fine dining restaurant, every seat has a number. So if you were to go to a very fine dining restaurant where you're ordering appetizer, main course, dessert, the way your order would be rung in would be like seat number 1 on table number 10 has this, coast by this, coast by that, and then the kitchen and the front of the house has to coordinate and
Right.
So it really is sort of a dance. That's the way
Yeah.
I look at it. It's theater. Like
Yeah.
when you, and this is something Danny used to say, like when say your restaurant opens at 11, it's curtains up. Everyone has a place to play, a place to be at, and a role to play. And you really have to leave your emotions aside and sort of be there to entertain, to take care of, to be hospitable. And those are the things that really sort of was a changing point for me, because in India, my experience had been you go in and there's something called a pre-shift sort of lineup. It's where you basically discuss what's coming up. So before lunch, there's lineup. Before dinner, there's lineup. Every day, every restaurant across the world. That's just the way it works. In India, that used to be basically checking grooming standards. At that time, smoking used to be allowed inside the restaurant. So your lighter chal raha hai ki nahi. And nothing about like what you do in the restaurant. I remember the first time I was in a lineup in the US. Literally, it was 45 minutes. You sat and ate the day specials. You sipped and tasted the wines that were being special. You spoke about it. It was almost like a study group that was happening. At its best form, it's a study group. At its worst form, it's just like a quick thing that happens. And you really can use that time to really shape the experience of your guests. So if now I know Sonu's coming in, I'll have notes on Sonu, on what she likes, what she dislikes. It'll be discussed. And when you walk in, there is a system in which that information is passed on to every part of the restaurant. Like being there, imbibing this, learning this, how it's done, was a complete life-changing experience for me. And if you think of it, like in India, why did my grandmother have that reaction back in the day, right? And it's still that, because unfortunately the concept of service equals servitude.
Right.
Shift in my mindset was, no, it's actually a conversation between equals. So hopefully if you come to one of our restaurants, we've spent years training that our teams need to be able to have conversations in a way that they are talking to you and taking you on an experience or a journey, and not just being a sort of but just repeating the menus or what you can read. It's actually, and you have to be able to read the table, read the room, what's happening every night. So it's, like I was saying earlier, it's a dance. It's a dance every night, and the chef are the directors of what's happening, and everyone else is playing their part.
No,
And it's beautiful when it all sort of is singing
comes
together.
together. No, it's fascinating, and I love, what you say, that it's almost like a performance where everybody is on stage and the guests are actually the audience. But you've just told us about what you need to learn as professionals who are part of the restaurant. Just tell us, what do we as guests need to learn?
I think it's interesting, right? Like I think every restaurant has a different outlook, and I feel the one thing, and I don't think this, I can stereotype on this, but I think in general, if there was more empathy, it would be great. Like especially in the last year and a half, it's unfortunate. Like we still have cases where like people will come and fight for like, why are you asking me? You have tables empty. Why can't you seat me? Because there's a 50% capacity. You can't be seated right now. There is, why can't I stand at the bar and wait? No, you can't. Like, as in, there is a pandemic going on around you. And in general, like I feel I think it was interesting. It was told to me a long time ago that you can always say a lot about a person, the way they treat servers in a restaurant.
Absolutely.
It's so true. It is absolutely true.
Yeah, it is.
And I think it's just that always goes into my mind. Like I've had to deal with multiple situations over the years where you just deal with entitlement at its core, and that's what it is. And we've thrown people out. We've thrown people out for being abusive. We've blacklisted people, because that is one thing which is a no-go for us.
Yeah.
You're most welcome to take your business somewhere else, but we don't need to stand for this.
Yeah. So while you were bussing in New York, in the US, any interesting customer experiences? Because like you said, you get to learn a lot about people, the way they interact. And you guys may be the performers, but the audience doesn't realize that they are also being observed. In this case, the guests. So what do restaurant professionals or hospitality professionals pick up from the way people behave. Also, any interesting experiences, good, bad, ugly, excellent, whatever.
The moment I said, for some reason, what came back to my mind was, I remember 1 month after joining, suddenly Gulshan Grover showed up at this restaurant where I was at New York. It was really random, but suddenly that memory came back. But honestly, like, I think there's a lot you can pick up because you have to become very sort of attuned to reading people's body language and mannerisms. Like, if you are there and you're deep in a meeting, I shouldn't be coming and explaining to you the antecedents of a dish. Like, you do not want to be disturbed by like the story of where this ingredient came from or showed up. At the same time, like, if you pick up like someone celebrating something, you can really do something special for them, which they don't expect. There is, again, going back to, so Danny wrote this book called Setting the Table, which I highly recommend, irrespective of what you do in life. Like, it's a great sort of book in terms of like what it takes to run a service organization. And he has this term in that, what we call ABCD, always be connecting the dots. And that's really something which is, I love it, and I've been practicing it for almost a decade now. Like, there's always dots you can connect to sort of make someone's evening super special. And how do you go about doing it in the simplest of ways? It can just be sort of that. I remember, like, if someone really enjoys that bottle of wine, we had a way of taking that wine label off and very quickly by the end of the meal, framing that wine label and presenting it to you at the end of the meal. And then suddenly you have that moment to take back with you in a very physical form. Small, like, it takes really small things. And I think the restaurants are definitely sort of social laboratories where you see all sorts of behavior at all times. And it's really interesting if you get into it. And I think our journey at Bombay Canteen, O Pedro, Bombay Sweet Shop now has been a function of continuously paying attention to behavior. Whether it is what works in Bombay, what doesn't work, what we want to do as a restaurant company, all of those things sort of comes out of being constantly curious. And I think that really is an important aspect as well.
Yeah, so I think it's a sobering thought for all of us that when we are expecting service and we expect the staff to behave in a certain manner, we are also performers to some extent, and we are also being observed. And I guess it's a two-way street. I mean, you treat people well, they treat you well back. So, I have a lot more questions about customers and all of that, but we'll come to that a little later. Let's jump straight to Bombay Canteen. How did that happen? And, I've been there a couple of times, and again, pre-pandemic. So, two questions I had. You keep talking about it's important to learn what to do and learn what not to do. So did your stint at college tell you what not to do regarding food and what to do regarding the tables?
Stint at college didn't, but like over the years, other experiences did. I think stint at college truly, like, if I look at what we do at Bombay Canteen still, is like take people on a journey and an experience. And I think that the first time I ever did...
Sorry. I think all the Stephanians hate you for calling it a canteen. I mean, we spend our life saying we don't have a canteen. We have a cafe. And here, you're...
Unfortunately, there were too many cafes already in Bombay by that time.
Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you asked that question, right? Like, the reason for calling it canteen specifically and Bombay Canteen specifically was to evoke that sense of nostalgia at some point and community at some point, which we've probably been through office canteen, etc. Like, the original name, actually, what we had, I'll come to that actually. How we sort of went about creating Bombay Canteen was, I was in New York City at that point in 2011, starting North End Grill with Floyd. And a classmate of mine, Yash, who's now my co-founder, both of us were at Cornell together. He was in Singapore working with the Fairmont Group, and we'd always joked about like being the two F&B focused Indian guys that kabhi wapas jaake kuch karenge. And not realizing that it would actually happen, right? Like, you became really thick friends. We would travel a lot together, spend a lot of time together. But what we shared was this love for food and this love for sort of creating ideas that would spark joy. And while he was in Singapore, I was in New York, we were seeing what was happening, and it goes back to the observation, right? what was happening in those countries was food in those countries was being reimagined by chefs for the current generation. So you had this in New York, suddenly that was the wave of the new American restaurants, which basically was playing on nostalgia, playing on stories of growing up in the States and reimagining them for that 2011 New York City or America. Similarly, same thing was starting to happen in Singapore. And as we look back at home, like we'd all grown up with Indian food. Like if any of us have spent time in the US or wherever else, we always look for that flavor similar to home. That's just intrinsic, right? Like that flavor memory is sort of so deep and rooted. And we were like, why is more of this not happening on the restaurant scene in India itself? Why is it that you basically have like continental restaurants and Asian restaurants? And if you need to eat Indian food, either you went to whatever the Moti Mahal copper chimney version of that in your city, and you knew your order even before you walked in. It'll be a naan, it'll be a butter chicken, it'll be a dal, etc. Or you ate at home, right? Like, but growing up, I remember like I sort of lived all over the country in Bangalore, Calcutta, Delhi because of my parents. I am from Lucknow and Agra. And like food would be very different, regional, seasonal, all of these things, which was completely lost in restaurants at that point. And this is all that you were seeing happening in restaurants across the world, that this is how people had started to cook. And I think the other aspect, which was quite interesting for me, was when I was in 2007 to 2010, when I was working in Delhi, the food was an afterthought to the vibe of a restaurant in India at that point. Like the vibe was great and you went there, and yeah, obviously the food obviously had to be at a certain level, but it wasn't thought through. The chefs were not I call like, food is the new music in a way today. Like you follow chefs and you follow what they're doing, etc. That journey had not started in India yet, and suddenly we was thrown into that journey in the US, and it became very clear to Yashimi that he and I would never cook. Yeah. We needed to find someone who would do that. So we came up with the original idea of Bombay Canteen, and it was rooted in our experiences going to clubs in India. Like I had always grown up in Delhi or Bangalore, and you'd always go to a club which was the center of the community, and that became sort of the canvas on which to reimagine Indian food. We were like, you need to tell the story which is familiar to people, but then also blow people away with the food. And we could think of no one better than Chef Floyd, who was my boss at that time. We pitched the idea to him, he agreed, and off we went. And off we went is like a misnomer, because it took us almost 2 years from that point to actually open Bombay Canteen. So this was in February 2013 when these conversations were happening. 2012 was when we sort of came up with this idea. By Feb 2013, I was moving back to India, and we opened in February 2015. That journey was sort of a hard one, because like landing with no experience, no backing as such, raising money, pitching these ideas, making sure that the sort of foundational things, that's where the real estate Citibank experience came in. A lot of use to scour the markets across. And while our heart was in Bombay, we honestly looked wherever we could get cheap real estate. And we ended up in Kamla Mills mostly because it was really cheap real estate at that point. Now it's a very different situation. But we are the oldest restaurant there now, even though it's only 7 years old. And it was really like, it was opposite side of the street where the action was, and our insight was like Lower Parel is where we needed to be, because it was locationally worked really well. And we opened in February 2015. And I think there is an element of like timing and luck that you have to admit to, that we were just the first ones off the blocks on this modern Indian sort of bandwagon, if I can call it that. And it was just refreshing at that point that there was a menu which was seasonal, driven by chefs, ingredients. We don't use anything that's imported at Bombay Canteen still. Having that ethos, sticking to that ethos. We made a bunch of mistakes along the way, but I think it was just a refreshing take on a restaurant, an Indian restaurant at that point, which had not been seen. And it was absolutely heartwarming to get the response that we did.
Yeah. So you do talk about the fact that the response was phenomenal. Now, and at that time, you've also said that you didn't understand why people were coming in, truckloads to you. But now with hindsight, even though it's just 7 years, according to you, what made a Bombay Canteen?
one, I think that initial sort of start we got because we were the only sort of people doing this in Bombay was really helpful. But I think eventually what people forget is, why do you go back to a restaurant? You go back to a restaurant because it offers you delicious food all the time, or a consistent experience which you really enjoy, and service which is hospitable. It's as simple as that. But to do that for a long period of time requires a different mindset. It can't be that everyone looks at like restaurants as a field of creativity. It's actually 90% consistency. And how do you build for consistency? And I think we were very, very clear, and this was very much sort of colored by my past experiences. As I was telling, Shalom basically like grew too fast. Like when you're adding stores, I helped open 3 restaurants in 6 months. You can't manage it. It doesn't matter who you are, you cannot manage it unless you have phenomenal teams under you, phenomenal organizational sort of culture going for you. Things will start falling apart. So we took a very sort of conscious decision at that point. For 2 years, we will not even think of doing anything else. Absolutely nothing else. Just lay the groundwork of what is happening. It just took us 1 year to find our feet. And as I was referring to you earlier, like we just made a lot of mistakes along the way. The way our cocktail program was completely incorrect for what India wanted to drink at that point. We miscalculated, like all of us are non-vegetarians, we really miscalculated how many vegetarians live around Lower Parel. We got a lot of flack for that in the beginning. Because all our vegetarian dishes were an offshoot of a non-vegetarian idea, and it just doesn't work that way. Learning how to create menus for India, given our collective experience in the recent years was all abroad for the entire team, was a huge learning experience. And if you come to a restaurant, like there are different ways, and like depending on who you are, you could be experimentative. So I need to have something for you for that. If you're in the mood for comfort, like that, it's a balancing act to write a menu. And how do you do that specifically for India, for that neighborhood? And I think that really was a great sort of learning curve for us.
Yeah.
And I think what has made us sort of this last 7 years is, at every stage when we've done something new, we've also said, let's wait to be able to settle this versus jumping onto the next thing. It's hard because and this is where like I feel the people and the village you surround yourself matters a lot. Like I am always, like Yash calls me, I'm always interested in the shiny new object, and he's sort of the one who calmly looks at the next opportunity and says, are we ready for it or not? He heads all operations for us. He's the detail oriented guy. Like, can we do this really at this point in time?
Yeah.
We opened O Pedro in 2017 and came out of this opportunity, which was brought to us by one of our guests, who eventually became one of our investors as well. And Bombay Sweet Shop really was a response to the understanding of what it means to be a restaurant company in India. Today for us, like it became very clear to us actually back in 2017 itself, as we were opening O Pedro, that this is not, what we are building is not scalable. And obviously we want to have certain amount of scale to live our lives comfortably and have that sort of continue to do what we do, because unfortunately passion doesn't pay the bills. So Bombay Sweet Shop was a response to understanding that India, unfortunately, you can't scale ideas like Bombay Canteen and O Pedro and just drop them in another neighborhood or another city and expect it to be like as successful. It requires that same amount of effort, and it's a lot of effort.
Yeah, so if I can interrupt you here, this was the question that was forming in my mind, that when you talk about consistency is what actually defines a good restaurant. When you do have multiple locations, how do you ensure that consistency? And you are now saying that it is not scalable. So then, are good restaurants just supposed to be just one location, and if you have to eat there, you just have to fly to that city, like I think people do around the world. So just help.
Yes, it's different style of restaurant. it's a different style of restaurant, and it really comes from like what is the kind of restaurant you are building, right? Are the bones for it scalable or not? Like at the end of the day, Bombay Canteen was meant to tell the story of how we grew up eating in India and specifically designed for Bombay. But it's a very involved experience. Like it is not the reason why it stands out and hopefully in most people's minds is because there's something unique about it. But it's unique because of the people and the care those people are putting in at that point in time. Now, can I find enough people to now put the same amount of effort in another one? Because it's not like that one chef, that one manager is going to get stretched the moment like you open a second one, a third one, move to another city. Like, so then you really need to have robust training and sort of finding talent systems in place to be able to do that. It's not doable. The question is, what do we as founders want to be doing? And at that point, we were clear that we wanted to be in Bombay. We didn't want to we get an offer every couple of months to move to another city, but it's not the same. Like I don't want to live in that city. I want to live in Bombay. But two, I think it's also a function of understanding what the market in India provides, right? Like just going and landing up in Delhi doesn't mean it's going to be successful. It requires that thinking and that curiosity to say what will work for Delhi. It's not just that if I put egg, like one of our most famous dishes is eggs Kejriwal, which is a response to being in Bombay. It's a Bombay nostalgia. And it was really funny that how that dish took off, because those who were in Bombay knew it was from Villingen and was inspired from there. And we turned it around with this green chili chutney we have. And it's that chutney which is addictive. Otherwise, it's bread, toast, and Amul cheese. It's really not something. It's that chutney that makes it. And it's funny because Arvind Kejriwal came to power right about then. And so everyone thought, who was not from Bombay, thought it was something to do with Arvind Kejriwal. So everyone was read Kejriwal and got attracted, and tells you about like people's behavior, right? Like you see something familiar, you get curious about it, you end up ordering it. There would be tables that would come, and tables of 15 who would order 15 Kejriwals because no one wanted to share. It was like bizarre. So I think eventually it's not that restaurants can't scale. I think it's a question of you wanting to decide what's to scale. So what I was starting to say earlier about Bombay Sweet Shop is specifically a response to scale, because we delve deep into so I'll dial it back again a little bit. We were traveling back and forth to help Floyd open his restaurant in New York at that time, called Pav Wala. And Yash was traveling through Istanbul and Paris, and he'd never been to either country. He'd not been to Turkey, he'd not been to France, but like every time he'd come back, he'd pick up a piece of that country in the form of its food and bring it back. And unfortunately, you go to an Indian airport and all you get is spices and masalas and like things which you can't really consume. Like in France, you get amazing cheese, mustards, etc. Like you can come home and just quickly. Similarly, in Turkey, like you'll have baklavas and Turkish delights, etc. And there's a whole thing around that. And we were like, why isn't there something around this? And his original idea was like, oh, it'd be amazing to do something with just chikki. Like imagine you're just making different kinds of chikki and like so you can productize it in a way. And as we started thinking, we were like, no, it's actually not about the chikki. It's about like the connection people feel with mithai and sweets in general. And suddenly the bones of it became the same. Like no one had looked at Indian mithai differently, ever. It was the same thing which you were used. And over the years, actually, it had become irrelevant in a way that you ate it during festivals and pujas and other things, but you never gravitated unless you have like one specific mithai which you really love and have grown up with. And no one had reimagined what mithai can be for today's day and age, which actually set us off on this 2-year journey where we got a chef on board back in end of 2017, early 2018. We've traveled as a team through India, working with mithai walas, working with basically local shops, etc., all across the country, because Floyd used to have this saying which still holds true: unless you don't spend time understanding the traditional ways of doing something, you can't reimagine them. So we actually as a team have spent 2 years traveling across India, understanding this. And then Bombay Sweet Shop came across as a response to the fact that why are things not scalable in India is because Delhi versus Bombay versus Bangalore are like 3 different countries. like taste change, behavior changes, etc. So that's your first limitation to scale. Because if you look at what happens in the Western countries is that you don't have to change your recipes for every new city you go. Like a Shake Shack burger or a McDonald's burger doesn't have to change its recipes. You look at what Domino's has had to do here in India. Domino's menu in Andhra Pradesh is very different from the Domino's menu in Punjab. And scalable, but it still needs to respond to behavior in India. Second is just the availability of real estate. It just doesn't exist. Like the right demand generators around, there are 4 pockets in Bombay which have the right demand generators for restaurants like ours to exist. And that's it. Like if you take a brutal, honest look at it, that's it. Like every real estate agent will sell you a pipe dream. But if you boil it down to brass tacks of like, are there enough residences around? Is there enough office traffic? What is the behavior after work? Even BKC versus Lower Parel behaves very differently, and you have to respond to that. And similarly in Delhi and Bangalore, etc., it's a myth that there is enough scalability available. There are enough companies that are trying it and are continuing to do it, but honestly, the pandemic has wreaked havoc and then some to those plans, and will continue to do so. So, which is why our theory was like food products. If I can take something to your home, that would be amazing. And the idea of mithai also started feeding into this on 2 fronts, because mine and this, what I was referring to earlier, like it also needs to appeal to you as the people creating or founding this brand. It needs to appeal to you you need to be inspired to create it. You shouldn't just create it because like there's a market gap. Yeah, sure, that's also a good reason to do it, but eventually you run out of steam, I feel.
Yeah.
Like for us, we like to create premium products, which is evident in Bombay Canteen and O Pedro, and the idea of playing with sugar allows for, again, a premiumization of a product. Like at the end of the day, you look at what you are willing to spend on. You are usually willing to spend on things which you consider a luxury and not. So I'll have a really tough time convincing you to pay 100 rupees or 200 rupees for a packet of chips, because it's not got that sort of luxury attached to it. But suddenly if I can look at different ingredients, like such as chocolate and yuzu and matcha and other things, like I can create a story which you'd be now willing to sort of pay for. So that was one sort of enabling factor, if I can call it. And 2 was that it was a complete white space, just the way Indian food was a white space in our minds in 2012 and 2017. Mithai is still a complete white space, and it's been an amazing sort of roller coaster of a journey creating Bombay Sweet Shop, because we had to relearn pretty much everything we do. So today, we're not just a restaurant company. We opened Bombay Sweet Shop in Baikala, in this old factory where we basically wanted to create Willy Wonka's mithai factory. That was our sort of thought process around it. We opened on the 5th of March, and the 20th of March, we had to shut it all down. And suddenly, obviously, we lost Floyd at that time, very soon after to COVID. And I think dealing with all of this, we reopened Bombay Sweet Shop in July as a complete sort of direct to consumer sort of. That was eventually the plan, but that was not our strength at that point. And we've spent the last sort of 12 to 15 months really learning with the same sort of thinking around being curious about what makes people tick at their home, and what makes people tick when they're ordering at home, and what kind of like innovating on the products. And I don't know if you've tried Bombay Sweet Shop yet, but
you opened just before pandemic, and after pandemic, all travel has stopped.
Nowadays, like you can go to our website and just order it home, and that's what it's meant to do. And we are launching all India shipping by the end of this year. And suddenly what I was talking about, suddenly this is scalable. It's the same thought process and ethos that has gone into it, which went into Bombay Canteen and O Pedro, but this was what it was.
Yeah.
This has the bones to scale.
Yeah.
Versus those ideas don't have the bones to scale, is the way I look at it.
Yeah. So, we've talked a lot about food and different kinds of foods, but to my original statement, if you can help us clarify, what is the connection between chemistry and food? We hear a lot about molecular gastronomy. What is that? I mean,
I hate it,
why?
Unfortunately. So the thing is, the version of it that came to India was completely completely bastardized, right? Like, so I came across little after college, I came across the term molecular gastronomy, and it sort of was, just to go into its history a little bit, it sort of had its evolution in sort of Spain. And there was a chef there by the name of Ferran Adrià, who really sort of pioneered this style of cooking, which was really deconstructing a dish.
So
and
just help
reconstructing.
us understand, what is this molecular gastronomy all about? How do you deconstruct a dish?
How do I deconstruct a dish? So I'll give you an example of something we created for O Pedro yesterday. I don't know how many vegetarians and non-vegetarians are there, but it's a very, very non-vegetarian dish that I'm going to talk about. There is a Portuguese dish by the name of called feijoada, which is basically a bean stew eaten by farmers. And if you think of how farmers would eat back, and this is again going into history a little bit, you would typically eat offcuts, which is not the best meat out there. You'd eat offal, kidney, bone marrow, etc., etc. So we've actually, and usually it'd be a bean stew. So we've created this with the same flavors of a feijoada, but we've created a bone marrow dish, which is then has a tongue and chili salsa on it, with a bean puree on a toast. So now when you put everything on that piece of toast and bite into it, because you typically would have feijoada with bread, the flavors are very true of the feijoada, but it's been presented to you in a very different way. So I think what it basically means is you could be used to a flavor or you could be used to a form, but I have changed the form or flavor of something which you could recognize, and everything else about it is different. That's basically sort of the thought process behind the construction.
So it's a flavor in a new form. So
or the similar, yeah, or the form of in a new form, or I could take the same form and give you a very different flavor. So I'm not
a laddu that looks like a laddu but is actually a meatball.
Could be. So, for example, it's good that you mentioned laddu. So, one of the things we really wanted to do is like, there's a Boondi laddu, which everyone loves. Everyone loves chocolate. We actually spent like almost 6 months figuring out how to make Boondi with chocolate. And everyone's eaten Bounty at some point, which is coconut and chocolate, and rum and chocolate is very popular. So when we launched, we had this chocolate Boondi laddu with coconut and dipped in a rum syrup. And it really is like reminiscent of so many things you would have eaten at different points, but it's in a completely different form that you would not be expecting these flavors to come to you. So that's what, and molecular gastronomy unfortunately got bastardized in India. And what Ferran was doing and what that whole school of thought was doing was telling stories through this new form, right? Like, so I remember going to this restaurant in London called Fat Duck, and the other sort of proponent of this sort of cooking is the chef called Heston Blumenthal. And it was a meal that just sang, like, but he was telling the story of his childhood, and like he has this very famous dish where you wear headphones, which reminds you of like you're sitting on a beach while eating this seafood dish. And unfortunately, what happened in India was everyone was seeing this on Instagram and just taking sort of the form of it and not realizing that you need to tell the stories in India. You don't have to tell the stories of like Heston growing up in sort of the beachside towns of UK. You need to tell the stories of India. And that's where it got really bastardized, in my opinion. I call it smoke and mirrors. You can put liquid nitrogen in anything and it'll freeze immediately. And unfortunately, I've seen it used so badly in India, so badly in India, that it's actually dangerous. As in, you can't just be like serving liquid nitrogen on a table without like proper sort of care being taken, etc., etc. And literally it's smoke and mirrors. So we've always stayed away from it. There's a lot of technique that goes on behind the scenes, which you as a guest want to eat something that's delicious. And at the end of the day, that's what matters the most. So we use a lot of the similar techniques. So I was really inspired. The first time I ever applied chemistry to food was because I was reading about Ferran back in the day. And there's a way to basically create a vacuum chamber, which I realized, and to infuse foods with any flavor you want. It's basically sous vide, as it's called, but you can also, obviously, as a 22-year-old, I wasn't getting a sous vide machine that costs thousands of dollars. So I actually remember going to a chemistry practical store in, I think it was in Kamlanagar somewhere, buying a vacuum chamber, figuring out how to sort of set it all up with a pump. And I was really fascinated by like basically taking a bowl, you put watermelon in it or cucumber in it and pour vodka over it. You switch the machine on, it creates a vacuum. And when you switch the vacuum off, all the vodka has gone into the fruit.
Oh, wow.
So I figured that out on my own using the chemistry that I did. And it's still like, it's that same thing. Like a lot of techniques we use are very, very rooted in chemistry. Like, in fact, if you're cooking a piece of meat on a grill, there is chemistry involved in the reaction happening to the meat, and understanding the chemistry behind that makes a huge difference. There's this absolutely fascinating guy, if you guys are interested in this topic. His name is Krish Ashok. He's actually very senior at TCS, but he's written a book recently which came out this year called Masala Lab. And for the first time, someone has explained the chemistry of Indian food, and it's absolutely fascinating. Like something as simple as marination, which we think like if you're cooking chicken at home and you marinate it for hours and hours and hours, it doesn't matter. You do it for 1 hour, you do it for 24 hours, you'll have the same effect. But if you delve into the chemistry, you'll understand why. And how do you sort of look at making cooking simpler and enhancing flavor. And like a lot of what we do, the reason for using technique should be to enhance the flavor and of something. And that really has been super useful to get deeper and deeper into.
Yeah. No, so Sameer, this is actually fascinating, but I'm aware of the time. So my last question to you is, what for you is a complete gastronomical experience?
I think for me, what is a complete gastronomical experience is where you forget time exists. Like for me, when you walk in and you walk out and you don't realize where the time is gone, where you've taken care. Actually, Fat Duck was one such experience. Like we went in, I remember at 2 p.m. When we came out, it was 7 p.m. and you didn't even realize where the 5 hours went. It was like this unbelievable meal where it just like I was talking earlier, it was a performance in every form. Like every step there was something happening by your table. There was something happening with drinks. I remember the dessert comes in this fascinating dollhouse, which you win a token at one of the earlier meals, and you put the token in and it opens up, and like it tells a story through which makes sense. And why do you get lost in a movie? Why do you get lost in a play, right? It's the same reason. Like the performance is just spellbinding. And that's a particular kind of dining. And at its simplest, like similarly, like for me, like that's what I miss these days, like having been stuck at home now for like the past 18 months, not having to experience that in a while. That's where one's mind goes to. But it can be just as simple as just biting into an amazing sandwich and like it being super comforting. So both have equal amount of weightage for me, but it just, I guess, depends on what kind of mood you are in that moment.
Yeah. Actually, I'm sure there are lots more to talk about, but let me first thank you for your time and stop this recording.